Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for the panel discussion, Nashville Through the Decades. I'm Daniel Diermeyer, Chancellor of Vanderbilt University. We're honored to be joined today by a group of distinguished Nashville authors who have each contributed their expertise and vital perspectives to understanding our city's history and its path forward. Whether you have lived in Nashville for years and witnessed its dramatic changes, or if you only know Nashville as the it city of today, this panel will offer insights on what to make of this unique moment. We are a city on the rise, full of potential and bright days ahead. Yet, like any place that has experienced such rapid growth, it's important to understand the people and forces that have shaped us and how we can work together now to build a city that benefits all its citizens. Today's panelists will offer key insights into these questions and more. We're grateful to Vanderbilt University Press for co-sponsoring today's event. Our panel will be moderated by Bill Purcell, who served as mayor of Nashville and Davidson County from 1999 to 2007. During his tenure, the city saw unprecedented economic expansion and historic investments in public education and affordable housing. He was previously a 5-term member of the Tennessee House of Representatives, later served as director of the Harvard Institute of Politics, and currently teaches public policy right here at Vanderbilt and practices private law in Nashville. I will now turn it over to Bill to introduce our panelists and begin the discussion.
Thank you, Chancellor Diermeyer. Thank you for that kind introduction, but most importantly, thank you for hosting this Chancellor's Lecture Series. The idea of connecting this university, Vanderbilt University, with the Nashville community is among the most important things, I think, both for Vanderbilt and for Nashville. Alexander Hurd worked hard through the 60s and the 70s to do just that. In this century, Gordon Gee kicked off with a major outreach to the larger community. And I think there's no time that is more important that we're all connected and that both the university and the larger Nashville community benefit from the resources of each. And there will be no better example of that than today. This very special panel, Nashville Through the Decades, is one that I've been looking forward to, and I know from the panelists, you will learn an extraordinary amount about both the city, its future, but most importantly, the way in which its past and its future are so connected. The first person I'd like to introduce is Margaret Renkl. Margaret is the author of Late Migrations, A Natural History of Love and Loss. Most recently, she's written Graceland at Last. This is now available through Amazon, actually, in an amazing way. If you order it right now, you'll be able to have it by dinner time in your home. I'm astonished by that, but that is possible, and I recommend it to you. She's a contributing opinion writer for the New York Times. On Monday, the 25th of October, she wrote, of course, The First Thing We Do, Let's Kill All the Leaf Blowers. We'll have a chance to explore that possibly during the course of our time together today. She's from Alabama. She wandered off to Philadelphia for a time, and she ended up in South Carolina to finish her studies and is now back in Nashville. I had an opportunity to speak to an early editor of Margaret's here in Nashville at the beginning, I think, of certainly her local writing career. Liz Garrigan wrote this, and I quote, "If you ask me, Margaret Renkl is the best ambassador for the American South since Eudora Welty. She's 100% Alabama and 200% intellectual, a girl who grew up exploring red dirt roads and creek beds, who is more erudite than most presidential cabinets. She's a former Harpeth Hall teacher who can identify butterfly species and who adopts mutts from the pound. If I need advice about anything, I call Margaret, and that's saying something because I live in Thailand." Margaret, thank you for joining us here today. I thought, frankly, of Willie Morris. Obviously, Liz thought of Eudora Welty. In either case, you are here in Nashville, even though, like Willie Morris, you had an opportunity in the north, not quite as far north as he. You're here in Nashville. Why are you in Nashville, Margaret Renkl?
Well, I came to Nashville because my husband and I came to visit my college roommate, who was in grad school at Vanderbilt in the library sciences program, and she took us down to Music Row and she talked, and my husband just fell in love with Bobby's Idle Hour. And the idea that you could just walk into any little dive bar in this town and hear great live music we both had accepted jobs in Athens, Georgia. And, this is what you do when you're young and you're in love and your partner says, wouldn't it be more fun to live in Nashville? You go, okay. And so that's why we came.
That's a pretty good explanation, and I appreciate it. We'll have a chance to follow up on Bobby's and all other aspects of Nashville at that time. Steve Haruch is an award-winning journalist as well, New York Times, NPR, The Guardian. He is the editor of the books Greetings from New Nashville, How a Sleepy Southern Town Became the It City, and also People Only Die in Movies. He was also edited by Liz Garrigan at an early stage in his career. And from Thailand, she wrote the following, and I quote, Steve as a youth is almost a caricature of old Nashville. He drove an old red van, and he started out freelancing brilliant music and arts pieces for the Nashville scene. As he became more widely published and more successful, so did Nashville. There could be no more perfect voice for the city's modern transformation than someone who has lived and thrived in Nashville's various incarnations, who started as a young writer and stayed to raise a family and write books and inform new and old residents of this storied city about our history and cultural trajectory. So Steve, why are you here?
Not unlike Margaret's story, I followed someone here who I had just started dating, and she got into school at Vanderbilt. And I had no intention of ever living in the South, but I thought I could live anywhere for 4 years, right? That was roughly 20 years ago. Speaking of the scene, the old You Are So Nashville If, one of my favorites is You Are So Nashville If You Never Meant to Stay This Long. So that's pretty much how it turned out for me.
Well, my favorite always was about the Parthenon. You are so Nashville if you think ours is better because theirs fell down. But in any event, there's a long list of those, and I look forward to any of those that you want to resurrect during the course of this hour together. Thanks. Let me say as the moderator that I have no favorites on this panel. I like each and every one of these authors equally, but I do have a favorite food. And Rachel Louise Martin had the exquisite insight to write a book about this food, about hot chicken, which is Nashville's only indigenous food, the food that was created here and shared with the world. But she had a larger insight than that. She, in writing about hot chicken, chose to write about Nashville through much, if not the majority, of its history. Her book, Hot Chicken, A Nashville Story, tells the story of Thornton Prince and the Prince family, but it does it through the lens of Nashville's history, beginning roughly at the time of the Civil War, running right through to today. She has her PhD from UNC, Chapel Hill. She's a storyteller and archivist of stories, and she declares a special interest in memory, not only the things that we remember, but the things that we choose to forget, which is, I think, a good way for us to begin the conversation here today. When cities think about themselves, they think about the future, what's ahead in the near term. Politicians, political leaders, others, business leaders think about where we're headed in the longer term. But these are three writers who have chosen not only to think about the present as prelude to the future, but also to think about it as the result of the past. When you're thinking about your writing and the way in which to place your thoughts in context, how do you decide about the period of history you're going to cover, and how do you, in the end, decide to move through that? Is it something you set on at the beginning, or is it something that changes as you do your research? And that's for all panelists, but Margaret, maybe we should start with you.
Well, I guess, I don't write books about Nashville. I write a newspaper column, and it only really tangentially concerns Nashville. Nashville is interesting to the New York Times because, not so much because of Nashville itself, but because of what Nashville is an emblem of. I mean, we are in some ways just a microcosm for the divide that obtains across the country, the divide between progressives and conservatives, the divide between the urban and the rural, and it helps that the seat of Nashville is much more liberal city is the exact same location as the seat of Tennessee's incredibly conservative state. So the conflict there, what happens when those two worldviews collide, is the same thing that happens really in North Carolina. It's the same thing that happens between Birmingham and Alabama, between Austin and the state of Texas, between Lexington and the state of Kentucky and New Orleans and the state of Louisiana. It happens all over the place, not just in the South. That is our real cultural divide right now. It isn't North or South or East or West. It's rural and urban. And so much of what happens here really does speak to or echo what's happening everywhere. So when I write about Nashville, it's not so much about Nashville itself as it is about what is happening in Nashville teaches us something about who we are as a nation.
So you would agree with, I'm sorry, go ahead, Margaret.
I was going to say that there used to be a saying in my days at the Nashville scene. I don't know if this predates Steve's days there or not, but Bruce Doby used to say, so goes Nashville, so goes the country. And that was true when I started writing for the scene in 1995, and it's still true today.
Well, Steve, that's a good place for you to pick up. A, is that the way you remember it? And B, does that make you hopeful or not about the future of the country?
That's a good question. I don't remember that saying. So, well, Bruce was gone by the time I started there, but that's sort of a subplot here. I think that for me and I think that in the course of putting together the new Nashville book, in some ways, what inspired it was starting to read these stories about other cities, roughly the size of Nashville, where the same kinds of things were happening, where neighborhoods were just getting knocked down block by block. And it seemed like we were, if not the leading edge exactly, we were sort of on the same path as other cities. And so that was a case where you felt like, if I can find anything out about why it's happening in Nashville, there is also this larger question that we'll also be addressing. I've met people from other places around the country when I talk to them about Nashville, and they talk about how much it's changed, and then they'll think of another place where it starts to look very similar. So that was a really interesting result of that process, is that sort of the more I focused on Nashville, the picture simultaneously became bigger.
And Rachel, I think you focused very heavily on that history, going back, as I mentioned, to the Civil War, but also particularly focused on what happened here during the period of redevelopment and the way it affected who we are and what we are today. Talk about that, if you would, both how you chose to the time, and then ultimately what it tells us in answer to both Steve and to some extent Margaret's points.
Yeah, well, I chose the time initially because I am by training an oral historian. So I'm always going to start with people who are still alive, which puts a certain amount of control over my time period. But then often the story grows from there. So in this one, I began by talking with Andre Prince Jeffries and the family that is currently running Prince's Hot Chicken Shack, but quickly discovered the story just naturally went back to the period of the Civil War. And unfortunately, because of how archives are constructed and because of how we chose to create records in earlier eras, you can't go back much farther than that. There is a very hard stop. There's a silence and a gap that is created in 1860. I tried to get past it, but I couldn't. So the sources created my timeline this time around. But I think there's so much power behind this idea of taking a microhistory, of diving deep into one place and really understanding the forces and the choices. it's easy when we look at the national story that's playing out today to say, we just ended up here. What else were we supposed to do? And when you look at one specific town, one specific community, one specific family, you can start to untangle that and say, no, along the way, everybody made choices. This is not an accident. It's not an act of kismet. It's not an act of God. We chose this. And we have to accept that, and we have to take responsibility for that before we can move forward and make new choices in the future. And that's really the purpose of a lot of my work, and I think the work of the other panelists, is how do we make new choices in the future?
Informed by both our past and a wide variety of inputs. And I think, Steve, you had to choose a number of different voices in your book to establish what you wanted. But tell us, if you would, how you chose what to include, and if there were things that you wished you could have included that you didn't, and maybe will be in the next book.
Oh, I like the idea of another book, but yeah. So the first task for me is sort of related to the previous question, which was deciding on what my timeline was. A lot of the conversations I would have with people about the way Nashville is changing, is people want to know, how did this start? Like, what set this in motion? And I came to the conclusion that 1998 was the year where there's sort of enough ingredients in the pot for the Nashville that we are experiencing now, for those flavors to start to develop, so to speak. And so once I had 98 and as my starting point, I started to think, okay, what are some places along the timeline that make sense as inflection points, and who is the best person to write those? So, some of these were easy, like, okay, Major League Sports coming to Nashville. I want JR. I mean, who else would I want to write that piece, right? Just kind of the perfect writer for that. There were a couple of good hot chicken candidates. Rachel, I actually thought about asking you to use your Bitter Southerner article, but I think in retrospect, it was actually served your project better for it to be the genesis of your own project. And so along the way, it was trying to find these inflection points. I knew that our schedule for turning this around was pretty tight, so it couldn't be all new essays. I also wanted things that were written at the time and maybe look a little different in hindsight than they did when they were published. So, Anne's essay from 2007, my piece on the tech startup scene, even by the time, it didn't seem that long ago when the book included it, but a lot of it seemed kind of dated in a way that I thought was very interesting. And like any book that covers a 20-year span, there's going to be stuff missing. The one that I was probably most disappointed that I couldn't get is I really wanted a piece that focused entirely on Kurdish American life in Nashville. There's some of that in Carrie's chapter about Nolensville. I had some hesitation about sort of making Nolensville one thing when it is so many things. And so if there was some way I couldn't find the right person who also had time to do it in the time frame that we had. So that's the one that I really wish I could have gotten in there.
Well, I look forward to your getting that into the next work, because as certainly everyone on this panel knows, but many others don't know, we are the largest group of Kurds assembled on the planet outside of Kurdistan in Nashville, Tennessee. And the story of how that happened and what that has meant for them and what that has meant for us is a great story. In fact, the first Iraqi voting that occurred in Nashville during the time I was mayor was an extraordinary moment of gathering Kurds and Iraqis from all across the Southeast here under tents at the fairgrounds. A story that's worth telling, but I think more importantly, what it's meant for the city of Nashville going forward. Margaret, as you were finishing your remarks, I was suddenly thinking of what James Carville said about Pennsylvania, that it's Philadelphia and Pittsburgh. and all the rest of it is Alabama. That's a paraphrase, but he admits that that's in essence what he said. And so I think there is an understanding that there is this urban-rural divide, and it applies in many, many states, Wisconsin and other places. And yet there is a special fascination by you about Nashville, and the New York Times, either through you and because of you, I think, but in any event, about Tennessee as an example for the rest. You too focused on the history here, and I'm thinking in particular about your focus on Fort Negley and the recent political actions there, which are reported, you wrote about in Graceland. What is it about Nashville in particular that you think fascinates you and then the world as you write about it?
Well, it's my home. I've been here 34 years now, longer than I ever lived in Alabama, close to twice as long as I lived in Alabama. And I think that for most writers, writing is an act of focused attention. It's of deciding what to love, and the easiest thing to love is your home. It's where you are, the people who surround you, the environment in which you live out your life. Those things are maybe especially for Southerners, although I don't know, I've never been anything but a Southerner, so I can't say that for sure, but that is a Southern trait, if not a uniquely Southern trait, is that we are dug in. And so I can't say for sure, honestly, that I wouldn't be writing about Birmingham in the same way that I'm writing about Nashville, if I had stayed there, or if I had stayed in Columbia, South Carolina after I left graduate school. Would, in my mind, Columbia, South Carolina be the fulcrum of the universe? I think it's truly just the kind of the bloom where you're planted sort of thing for me as a writer.
Well, Rachel, you think a lot about memory and memories. I know. Albert Schweitzer once wrote that happiness is but good health and a poor memory, but that's not your point. I think, Rachel, that we have to remember, and each of you, I think, has spent a fair amount of time both remembering how we were and thinking about how we are and how we will be. Talk about what it is that fascinates you in the memories of Nashville and the things perhaps we've forgotten as well.
Yeah, there's so much power in silence. And I think as a kid, I saw it as people used silence themselves for power. I mean, we can think of this as like giving other people the silent treatment, right? But this is a massive story, means I should probably write about it, but I was not able to speak for the first 5 years of my life. I had some issues going on. And so I was silenced in that way. And I think that experience of not being able to speak up for myself, not being able to communicate clearly, really shaped my concerns about the world. And as I grew, 45 minutes south of here, down in Las Casas, and watched who was able to speak, who was given space and a voice and an ability to speak up for themselves, and who was not allowed to do that. It confused me as a kid, and as an adult, it informs a lot of the work I do. And as I was going through graduate school, I quickly saw all of the places within the official records we created where people's lives were erased. Again, in many cases, just never even written down. So you go to census records and you will find so much information about a certain class and race of people, and you can't even find the names of others. And so that getting back past that block and beginning to adjust the record is something I really care about. I think of memory as being like music. We as a society, have gone for solos or nice duets, or perhaps a carefully orchestrated band. I'm trying to turn this into a symphony, and let's make it real modernist. Let's make it real clashing. Let's see what happens when we actually acknowledge the tensions within the world we live in and we hear all those voices. To me, that's what's beautiful.
Well, Steve, thinking about then those voices that are unheard, and that Rachel, I think, would tell us need to be, in an affirmative and careful way, now made a part of our, not just our collective consciousness, but frankly, our history starting now. Who do you think we've not been hearing from? What voices, what parts of this community need a larger focus by all of us?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, first of all, and there's been some conversation about this lately. I think that our, as a city, maybe we have thought about our Latinx community as sort of one blob that I think is disproportionately underrepresented in civic life, maybe. I think that's one area where I think we could be listening better, maybe advocating more. I'm thinking about the powwow recently, and I think that there's still a lot of Native history that we haven't really reckoned with here in our civic conversation. God, and I feel like the only time that we hear from trans folks is when they're like defending their right to exist. Like, it's lawmakers want you to not exist. Do you exist, and should you be allowed to exist? And then we're on to the next thing, and we don't get to experience like the joy and interest of their lives. It's always like, yes, please let me live my life. And then like, that's the end of the story. So I would say those three are the first that come to my mind as communities and people that we could definitely hear more from.
Margaret, thoughts in that space?
I guess one thing I agree with everything Steve said, and one thing I'm interested in is watching people through the auspices of social media insert themselves into a conversation that doesn't welcome them. And I can't think of many good reasons for Twitter to exist, but that's one of them. I think about the Twitter collective Black Opry, for example, the Black artists, especially the female Black artists who are reclaiming country music. Country music has two sets of forebears, as we all do. And one of those sets is West African. And yet we have a massive racism problem in, country music, as it is, at least as it is perceived, by the outside world, by the national media. And, it's for good reason. I mean, you think about Morgan Wallen's, little snafu where there's a video of him, using a racial epithet, and, his label responded, by various ways of putting him on probation. And yet the album sales soared. And so, that's what we need the voices of people, not to be offered permission, but by the stakeholders who already have all the power, but to just insert themselves and demand the attention. And I love it when that happens.
Rachel, do you have anything you'd like to add in terms of Nashville?
So I would agree with everything that has been said so far about this. And one of my favorite Twitter people, if we're talking about Twitter, bless it, once said, if I give voice to the voiceless, I am keeping someone else from telling their own story. And I think about that a lot as a writer, and especially as a white writer, that challenge of not taking up space, but instead creating space. I hope that by doing oral histories and putting people back into the archives, telling their own stories in their own voices, I hope I'm part of that. I try to create conversation in my work instead of speaking for people, but it's a real challenge. And I suspect it's a challenge that all three of us are constantly wrestling with, when to speak and when to get out of the way.
Well, in that space, then, what are the stories that you think need to be told now, or certainly sometime soon? The stories about Nashville that haven't been explored need to be published, whether it's by you or by someone else. And the good news is you might inspire 5 or 10 good books, or at least a few good op-ed pieces by somebody else or more, or by yourselves. What hasn't been written about, or that you would wish someone else or yourself could write about in the near future?
I think there's an incredibly important story to be told about the history of immigration in Nashville. We've talked about Kurdish immigration, going back into the 1990s, looking at Egyptian immigration and how Opryland Hotel played in. It's so fascinating. But even going back earlier than that, I think we often say immigration in Nashville is new, and it's not. It's something that has been happening. And so if we could redefine ourselves as a city, instead of saying, well, we're a city of the people who were here for 6 generations until the new people came, it might really help us move the conversation forward. I think there are also some very important moments in Black history that have played out here in Nashville that have not yet been explored. There were some fascinating and radical Black activist initiatives around history, because I love history, but around history, that were happening in the 1960s down along the Jefferson Street corridor and on Fisk University. Some attempts to open up a People's College, some things like that. And yeah, more needs to be said about that, so that we don't just look at ourselves and say we know who we are and we know who has been here doing the work. Instead, we start to challenge that.
Margaret, Steve?
Well, I might just sort of jump on to what Rachel was talking about there. I mean, again, in agreement, that Jefferson Street is something that came to my mind. I think that so much of the, I think sometimes we are able to talk about Jefferson Street as it sort of relates to the interstate cutting off the neighborhood and that conversation, but so much of the, again, so much of the joy and just the cultural incredible place that was before it was destroyed. A lot of that, a lot of those stories are not easy to find. A lot of them are there if you look for them, but I definitely would like to see that that history brought forward sort of more clearly. You know, this is maybe a little self-serving, but I think the history of Asian Americans in Nashville is reaching a very interesting point. The push for an Asian American Studies program at Vanderbilt right now, the incredible sort of energy in the Asian American student population in the city right now, I think is a very interesting thing. It's not necessarily a new thing, but the numbers are new. And so I think we may be reaching an interesting inflection point where that's concerned.
Well, let me add to that. Frankly, the whole decision of Bridgestone to move the first Japanese headquarters out of California to Nashville, and Toyota to Kentucky, and Toshiba to Nashville, and all that's followed from that, I think that's a story that has not been told either. How the decision was made, but then frankly, what it was like over the next several decades. All of it a piece and a part of our economic history, but frankly, you're right. I think part of our social history as well, and it's not been told. Margaret, thoughts in that space?
Well, you know, just to move slightly away from the human story to the story of our environment. When I got to Nashville in 1987, I was kind of dumbfounded, honestly, by Warner Parks, by how, 3,000 acres of woodlands here in the it's basically Belle Meade. It's not exclusively Belle Meade, but some of the most expensive real estate in the city, dedicated to the woods and Radnor Lake. And in the years since, the continued expansion of a greenway system. And we had the makings in Nashville of, a kind of a formative, almost lead city. We were way ahead of most cities of the same size in protecting green space. And we know that having access to green space it's not just a matter of, preventing stormwater runoff by having actual soil for the water to run into, and protecting flood zones so that the water has somewhere to go when the rivers and the creeks rise. It's also it's a human justice issue. People who have access to green space are emotionally stronger. They're healthier people. There has been a study of people who've recovered, who are in the hospital recovering from exactly the same operation. Those people who have a view outside their hospital room of a tree recover more quickly and with fewer complications than those who are looking at a brick wall or an HVAC system. So we know that green space is inequitably distributed just by, for example, the existence of where some of our most beautiful parks are, but we haven't done anything with that. We have the potential, as we're in the midst of this explosive growth, to do it in a deliberate way that makes pocket parks accessible to low-income residents. Well, the ones that are left who can still afford to live here, and creating sidewalks that make it safe to walk, and bike lanes that make it safe to get around, and a transit system that actually moves people from Nashville to the outlying areas where people increasingly live because they can't afford to live in Nashville. All of those things, I think, if we look at where we've been, we have a vision of a city that understands the importance of green space. We just passed a law, that the Metro Council just passed a law that protects, or has the mechanism for protecting, trees on public property, but we have nothing that protects trees on private property, which is of course most of the trees. I mean, people regard the trees on land that they own as their trees, and that's not what they are in the age of climate change. They are our trees. That tree canopy is protecting all of us from the worst ravages of climate change. And so I think as a city, that's where we need to put a lot of our energy, whatever you have to say about gender justice and racial justice and health justice, none of that will matter if the whole planet goes up in flames. So that's a huge thing I think that we need to address and have not even come close to adequately addressing.
Rachel, you've looked some about the allocation of these kinds of resources like green space and others across the city. And I think it would be fair to say you've observed that the blessings of those parks were not equally shared across Nashville throughout our history. Do you see that as Margaret does, obviously, as an important place for investment now in Nashville?
Oh, I think it's vital. I think it is absolutely vital. The entire idea of constructing a city that is built for people instead of a city that is built for businesses, or that is built for government, or that is built for development. At the moment, in many parts of Nashville, we are creating a very inhuman city. We are building a city where it is hard for people to interact with the environment, where it is hard for people to interact with their neighbors, where it is hard for people to interact with people who live beyond their neighborhood. And all of that is going to further fracture us. It's going to make everyone unhealthy mentally and physically, but it is especially going to hurt the people who are most vulnerable. And we need to address that. And doing that is going to mean that, some people might not earn quite as much money, on every development. But we as a community will be a much better place to live. And this is affordable housing. This is building parks. This is finally creating a functional, or recreating. We used to have a pretty functional mass transit system that we decided to destroy. So recreating a functional mass transit system that gets people where they need to be. All of those things are vital to us moving forward. I'm afraid Nashville is going to begin capping its ability to grow and capping its ability to be an it city by going for the short-term gains instead of looking at how we thrive, how everyone can thrive here.
Well, now that you've mentioned the it city, it's an easy pivot back to Steve, who has written about just that subject. Steve, who are the your book continues to pop up in references, in a wide variety of references to Nashville. It continues to capture, I think, people's attention in the way it reflects the facts here. Who do you see as the influencers going forward in the spaces we've discussed, and frankly, in all the other areas of concern that you raised in your book?
Yeah, well, I have to say that probably the person that I most wish I had known while I was putting the book together is Andrea Williams, who's just done some incredible writing. As Margaret was talking about, sort of the reckoning that's happening in country music, Black artists asserting their rightful place in the genre. She's done great writing about that. I don't know if you read her obit of Charlie Pride, which was just this amazing, like, it tells his story. It's about Nashville. It's about the South. It's about everything, but it's about him. I wish that I had known her and had been able to talk her into writing something for this book. I think she's just doing great work. I don't know what it is about the name Williams, but Dr. Lerotha Williams also comes to mind. His book with Amy Thurber, I'll Take You There, about social justice sites around the city. I think his North Nashville Heritage Project is such an important ongoing work, and I just think, I think he's doing such great work, and I will listen to anything he says.
Thanks. That's a good assignment. Margaret, in Graceland at Last, I don't think it's giving away anything that the last chapter is about Graceland. And I need to tell you that it spoke to me especially because when our daughter, who's older, I think, than your boys, two oldest boys maybe, was graduating high school, my wife suddenly, and this had never happened before, announced over the breakfast table that our daughter had to go to Graceland before she graduated high school. Now, I thought, having heard that this was peculiar to my family and to my wife, who grew up in rural Shelby County, Tennessee. But as I read your book and that chapter in particular, I realized that there's something more there that drove you to say the same thing to your own family. We must go to Graceland. And so I'm wondering, here we are in the Music City. What you must have analyzed this. What is it that you think caused you to have this strong belief, even though you had never been to Graceland, but you felt and believed that your children needed to go to Graceland before they went out into the larger world? Was it Elvis? Was it music? Was it Memphis? Why did you need to go to Graceland?
Well, it was probably actually more Paul Simon than it was Elvis, just because, that album, Graceland, his album was so popular during the time when my husband and I were getting ready to move to Nashville. And even as an Alabama girl, I don't know if you've noticed this, but you can live in Nashville and get no news from Alabama. None, though we are 80 miles from the Alabama line. And you can live in Alabama and know nothing about Tennessee, like, for example, how far Memphis is from Nashville. So I had this idea that Graceland would be a more accessible place to me once I moved to Nashville. And it was more accessible to somebody living in Nashville than to somebody living in Birmingham, Alabama, or Columbia, South Carolina. but it was the wrong direction for us. Our families were all East and South. But there's something about Elvis's story, even though I didn't grow up listening to Elvis. My parents were big band music listeners. But that story of a poor Tupelo, Mississippi boy who revolutionized, music, at least white music, and, and came to feel wealthy, but still this poor kid from Tupelo, Mississippi. The idea that was his idea, that house was his idea of the pinnacle of success. It's a little bit, I don't know. I had a tender feeling for him, just because it's really so modest by today's standards of wealth and lavish displays of success. The whole downstairs of Graceland is not any bigger than most, kitchens these days, and the McMansions going up in all the neighborhoods where houses are being scraped off the land. So I don't know. It has, there's nothing coherent to say about my feeling about Graceland, except that I felt at home there.
And that's the way you concluded your work. Was there anything else about the inspiration of of bringing that particular set of your columns together, or that got you thinking in that way, or is it simply is it just your work during this time?
No, it's actually not that much of my work. It's probably 20 to 25% of the columns I've written for the Times. So it was partly, it was, when the Caroline Kay, who runs the book development department at the Times, came up with the idea for a book of columns, of my columns, I just was trying to think of which particular collection would hang together as a book and work collectively so that each piece added to something bigger, and not just a random collection of things I liked that I've written during the last 5 years. And so what I tried to do with Graceland at Last was give as nuanced a picture of the contemporary American South as I could, as somebody who writes from her own experience, and not as a historian, but as just a person moving through the world. And that's limited as it might be by one person's perspective. That's what I tried to do. So I picked and chose and arranged on the basis of what can I put in here that is going to make somebody inside the South say, thank God somebody sees me, and somebody outside the South say, I had no idea.
I know it's still early yet. Has there been any surprise in the reaction of folks to the work so far? I'm going to ask each of the rest of you that question, but Margaret's just on camera at the moment.
I think, I guess if there's anything surprising to me, the book is divided into 7 sections, only one of which involves politics and religion. But that has been what people have most wanted to focus on in interviews, at least, was the political writing. When you're writing a book and you're trying to make sure it doesn't immediately fall out of date by the end of the year in which it's published, there can't be that much about politics. That world changes so rapidly. But I was surprised by how many people online, especially, and how many letters I've gotten from people who are saying that as liberals, they feel so grateful to see themselves in a book, and what it feels like to be someone who politically is out of step with the region, but who loves the place where they live and the people they live among, even so. And so I didn't realize how alienated liberals in the South feel from the way they are represented in the national media until this book came out.
Rachel, what surprised you in the weeks and months following the publication of your book?
Well, I launched my first book in the middle of a pandemic, so I really had no clue what to expect. I think probably for me, the most surprising part of it has been how many people are not just willing, but very anxious to begin engaging in a conversation about how we are building not just Nashville, but the nation. And really making the connections that I was hoping people would make, that the story I was telling of urban development and urban renewal and cultural appropriation of all sorts here in Nashville isn't just a story about this town. It also happened in Durham. It happened in Charlotte. It happened in Atlanta. It happened in New York. It's Los Angeles and Denver and Portland. And I've been so pleased that folks have got that. And I have loved getting to be part of that conversation.
I understand. Steve.
Also kind of the pandemic book launch, it really sort of tempers your ability to see a lot of the reaction, I think. But honestly, as someone who used to moderate the comments on this Nashville Scene website, I think that maybe the thing that's surprised me the most is that I haven't gotten a lot of complaints about the book. I was, you say the words "It City" in any group of people in Nashville, and someone's going to be annoyed that the term has even been said aloud, right? And so I think maybe that I was just sort of expecting a lot of, why didn't you talk about this? Why didn't you say that? Why isn't this person in there? And that hasn't really been the response at all. And again, it may just be the sort of, the shell shock from years of moderating the comment section, which, they tell you don't read the comments, but I've read every single comment for years. And, that has a kind of lasting effect on you. But I think that I've been very pleased that I think that people have approached the book in the spirit that it was intended, that it is the beginning of a conversation. It is trying to pull many things together in one place to give a sense of how the city has changed and begin to answer why, and knowing that all of this is still in motion, and that I don't have all the answers. So I've been very pleasantly surprised by the reaction to it.
Well, I appreciate, Steve, that you had that experience. I'm amazed actually at that particular experience in your life, and the fact that you were still able to pick up and write and go out in the world, because you're right. All of us at this moment in time have a variety of experiences with the strong opinions. I suppose as a last question to all of you, the question maybe front of mind for many is anybody listening? Are people willing to listen and change now? How do you feel as someone who clearly is sharing a story, not just to share a story, but to ultimately have a greater effect beyond the reach of normal words? How do you feel about that and your optimism for the future? That could be an hour-long conversation, but in as short a way as you can, in conclusion here today, are people listening? What keeps you sharing, and what's your optimism or lack thereof for the future?
I think I'll tackle that one first. I think that in a lot of ways, the speed of the internet sometimes makes us feel like all reactions are incredibly fast and incredibly strong to whatever the piece of work is. And in some cases that's true, but that's not, all of life does not happen on the internet, and all of life is not broadcast onto the internet. And, putting this book together, putting together the collection of Jim Ridley's work, again, over covering 20, 30 years in that case. And talking to people about things that they read 15 years ago that still stay with them. There is this 24-hour rapid fire cycle of memes and news and trending topics that we are all to some degree sucked into. But there are these other rhythms, there are these other longer cycles that as humans, we can't help but process some things more slowly, but also more deeply. So, just because, a book isn't a bestseller the week that it comes out doesn't mean that it's not going to be an incredibly important book someday. I still believe that those things happen, those interactions with culture and with each other happen in very meaningful ways, even though sort of the peripheral speed of information has gotten so much faster.
Yeah, it's easy to get discouraged on this question, especially over the course of the last year, 2 years, 6 years. Just seeing how increasingly fractured my social media timeline is, or my family is, as people are quickly jumping to very hard conclusions that they're not willing to discuss or negotiate or consider, often that are backed up by I'm not even gonna say what I consider, that are often backed up by very shoddy pieces of evidence. It worries me greatly. But I do get messages through my website or comments on my pieces or responses when the couple of times I've been able to give a reading in a pandemic, from people who are asking questions, who are trying to grow, who are trying to wrestle with this. And I'm just clinging to that right now, that there have to be enough of us on both sides that are trying to be thoughtful, that are more interested in questions than answers. And I think that's a critical part of this. We go to answers so fast because I think partially because of social media, partially because of where we're at politically and other things. But there are people who are still seekers. And I have to trust that the seekers are going to find each other and start making a difference. At the same time, I do fact checking on that take me into white supremacist spaces regularly. And at that moment, I have no hope for the world. So you've got me on a good day.
Margaret, is this a good day?
Oh gosh, every day's a good day, Bill. We're here. We survived a pandemic, not would. I feel the same way. I think as Steve and Rachel feel that if you take the narrowest possible approach to what is happening this minute, this hour, this day, even, it's very hard not to feel lost in despair. But then whenever the world throws out evidence that most of life is not lived online, when just about everybody hasn't really formally left Facebook, but has sort of given up on Facebook just because Facebook has gotten so boring. The same 5 people showing up in your timeline saying the same thing over and over again. It's just not any fun anymore. And then I think the act of publishing a book and trying to talk with people about that book and hearing what people have to say about the book is a heart-lifting experience, really. I had the wonderful opportunity to talk with a book club in a little town in Louisiana, and they were mostly older women, and they were telling me all kinds of things that they would never feel comfortable saying in a public forum because of a fear of being leapt upon by people who are angry and who have received some benefit from anger. whether that's monetary or whether that's a form of social currency. I don't know. But most people, I think, are not that interested in being angry. Most people want to find connection and are willing to listen, at least insofar as they as they have to be able to find some point, some jumping off point where they share, whether that's their kids are the same age, or they both love dogs, or they grew up in the same neck of the woods, or they both love Elvis. There's always something there that is a starting point if we can just get beyond the noise. And that's the difference between writing a column and writing a book, or writing a tweet and writing a book, is that the book gives you it's a longer form, and it goes across time in a way that allows for a conversation that, in my experience, people are eager to have.
Well, thanks to Margaret Renkl and Steve Haruch and Rachel Martin, and to our Chancellor for this time together. It was about decades of Nashville, but it was about so much more. And I leave optimistic and looking forward to all that you will do in the months and years ahead. Thank you all. Take care.